last breath's gonna come with me.
Just take it all.
You come and you go.
Come to me.
We are talking about the grindhouse horror movie Close Calls. This one is directed and written by Richard Stringham, and this one stars Jordan Phipps in her debut feature appearance. So this is essentially a kind of home invasion horror film, but it's done with a kind of a grimy grindhouse, almost retro style. But it is actually set in contemporary times. We see mobile phones, modern cars, etc. So ultimately what we have this sort of teenage girl who has been a bit of a kind of a wild child since her mother's death, and her father is kind of like, you know, despairing of her. She's kind of, you know, sexually involved with the neighbour, she's doing kind of lots of drugs, stuff like that. Anyway, he's out on a date and he's kind of grounded his teenage daughter in the house, looking after the elderly grandmother who seems to be a little bit cuckoo. And when she's kind of alone in the house, she gets a series of calls from seemingly some type of stalker, and there seems to be like a kind of home invasion by this apparent, could be friend, could be foe, and what will happen, you have to watch the movie to find out. So that's all I'm kind of saying on Close Calls. So what do we think about the movie? So this one comes out from Terror Films on the 11th of January 2019, and like I've said, it's a kind of almost like a kind of a retro style film. The kind of the graininess, the kind of the soundtrack, just kind of like some of the poster art and stuff like that. It tries to give the kind of the impression it's obviously at least influenced by the kind of like movies of the kind of the 70s and 80s. It has almost a kind of somewhat of a kind of a giallo kind of influence as well, I would say. So fans of kind of like the older style, kind of like more grindhouse style horror films may want to check out. This movie also has an undeniable kind of sexual tone throughout it. Jordan Phipps, who is the kind of our lead actress here, is you know, very kind of voluptuous when she spends a good portion of her time in just her underwear. And there are kind of, you know, quite a few kind of simulated sexual situations and, you know, kind of like potential kind of rape scenes and stuff like that. So if you're kind of adverse to that sort of thing, this may not be the film for you. But even outside of that, you just feel like it's still a part of this movie. The end scene as well is very kind of, you know, Geiger would be proud, let me put it like that. What else? I've got to say, I think Jordan Phipps makes a likeable kind of lead character. She certainly, I think, is the best actor here, and gives a kind of a a solid performance for a kind of a a straight to DVD horror movie. I think she's kind of makes for quite a, despite the fact that she's a bit of a terror, you still kind of like the fact that she's still kind of a likeable kind of person, and you do get the impression that she's somewhat independent. That comes across in her performance. That was quite good. There's also some quite reasonable practical effects here, and like I've said, this movie does kind of go a little bit close to the knuckle in some of the more controversial kind of elements, because our character is relatively young, and the kind of the antagonist in the movie, we learn has had an infatuation from her for when she was a child. So, you know, it certainly comes close to being somewhat controversial. And I was reading, apparently, when this movie was getting made, there was productions with when they went in the production of this movie, there was issues because obviously it was somewhat of a kind of controversial topic. You know, it's not a kind of like a Serbian film or anything like that, but it's kind of, it just goes maybe a step far for some people, but it's like I said, there are worse out there certainly. What the issues with this film? There's one big one, and this is by far and away the biggest issue here. This movie is way too long. It's over 2 hours, and this movie needs to have 30 to 40 minutes of cut out of it because it just outstays its welcome. To be honest with you, there's not a lot of plot here. So a film that clocks in at over 2 hours does not need to be this length. There's certain scenes here that I feel are completely extraneous. The epilogue, for example, I don't think makes any sense and could have just been done with cutting that out. There's a scene with this girl's boyfriend that has no relevance on the plot at all. That could have just been cut out. It would have made the actual running time a lot more kind of taut and kind of like wrapped up the tension. But as it stands at the moment, and the length of time that it is, the movie does come a little dull. The acting as well, George and Phipps aside, I think some of the actors here are on a little bit of the weaker side. Some of the kind of the line delivery here feels a little unconfident to me, and just a little bit ill-practiced, if you want my honest opinion. Some of the things just don't make sense. The beginning of this movie is kind of weak, I've got to say. There's lots of kind of like psychotropic kind of drug influences on this movie. Apparently, reading some of this movie, a lot of this was inspired whilst the director was on mushrooms. So it kind of shows, and that's all well and good, but for a cohesive movie, I feel it just comes across as a little self-indulgent. The movie does sort itself out towards as the film progresses, but I've got to say, some of the kind of the tones and the kind of the some of the imagery just a little weird. For example, we had this granny who's kind of upstairs, and this looks like a relatively modern house, but you go into the granny's room and it looks like the Evil Dead shack. It's just bizarre, and there's certain things within the movie that you just feel a little bit kind of inconsistent, and if you like kind of like things that don't quite make sense, and little kind of continuity errors and stuff like that. But the main problem is, like I said, ultimately there's not a huge amount of story here. It's essentially a home invasion movie. It's somewhat on the kind of the controversial level, and the movie's just way too long. I mean, had this movie been a lot shorter, I thought it could have been quite the thriller, but as it stands, it's not a thriller. It is kind of dull at times. So there is some craftsmanship here. I do feel there's some certain artistry behind this movie, and some of the kind of the kind of the influences are plain to see. And if you like kind of like your throwback movies, even though technically this is takes place in contemporary age, it still feels like one of those kind of like the older kind of style films and stuff like that. But it just feels a little bit too self-indulgent, and I think what it needed to have some outside eyes on this movie, people who weren't in the production maybe, to kind of like rein Richard Stringham in a little bit, I think. So as it stands at the moment, I'll give it a 5 out of 10. If you are a Grindhouse fan, you may want to check it out. Anyway, have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.